also. But if you're ever feeling bad about yourself, I've done worse than you have. Guarantee it. Oh, I don't want to end the meeting. I just started. All right. Graded potentials could definitely stimulate an action potential. They might not. To say that they never stimulate an action potential is not true, right? This is entirely dependent on the magnitude of that graded potential. Do graded potentials lose strength as they travel through the cell? They do. No, they don't. This is gain. Do they gain strength? No, because they lose it. Sorry, I just answered my own question. They are not used in long distance signaling, right? Because they lose strength as they travel, especially even if it's over a short distance. That indicates to us they're not good for cross-body communication. So there we go. McKenna, Fernanda, and Jade. Where do they happen? Had to get a good Ronnie meme in there. Why I'm gonna try to find as many Schitt's Creek memes just for you. I don't know what your problem is. What kind of hole in your heart is there that you can't like Schitt's Creek?
Tried watching it, I didn't think it was funny.
Well, you're not funny. I started watching it too, and I was like, I'm not into this. But then so many people liked it, I just kept watching it. Now it's my favorite show of all time.
Yeah, people told me they watched further, but I was like,
Yeah, well, it's fine. You can miss out on that exquisite part of life. They occur in the cell body and in the dendrites. They don't occur in the axon, right? What occurs in the axon? An action potential. Good. Jade, Aiden, and Valerie. I swear I saw Keely earlier. And she was walking up to the third floor and I said, where are you going? I was joking. And then I was like, oh, are you going to print out your notes? And she said, yes. But then I thought maybe that's not Keely. And she's not here. So I'm thinking maybe I was talking to someone else. And she's like, why are you talking to me? Hyperpolarizing events are not excitatory. Hyperpolarizing events are, in fact, inhibitory. So that is our 10-yard penalty, right? It's inhibitory. It's making it harder for you to get your first down. Does everyone know what a first down is? If I know it, I just assume everyone in this room at least knows that much. Okay. So yeah, if the other team, whatever reason, gets a penalty and you move up 5 yards, now you just cut the distance in half that you have to go, right? So that's excitatory, right? That's exciting for you if it's your team. You're getting closer to getting that first down. If you're getting moved back and back and back further, that's very less exciting, right? Like if it's the Super Bowl and then the Chiefs are back 30 yards because they keep getting penalties, that's very depressing. So there you go. Enough out of you. So the integrating center of the neuron, that's true, right? The axon hillock. That's we talked a lot about this threshold. The threshold membrane potential value is -55. That's true in the axon hillock or that trigger zone. We don't care what the membrane potential is in the dendrites. I mean, we do a little bit because that kind of tells us or gives us an estimate of maybe it's going to make its way to the trigger zone or not. But what we really care about is the membrane potential there. There is a high concentration of sodium ion channels there. Sodium ions are the ion channels are what open first. So it makes sense that we would have a lot of them there. Jade, Aiden, and someone, I forgot. Thanks, Ashley. You, sir. They are all or nothing. Oh yeah, so I wrote this question last night, and then I was like, I only ever write all answer choices are correct when all answer choices are correct. So let me mix it up. So you guys are all on to me. So I'll have you pick that. Action potentials. Do they lose strength over long distances? No one picked that, so I don't know what I'm talking about it. They don't significantly alter ion concentration. So that was just one of the caveats. That was one of the special notes on the slide. That said, in fact, we alter the concentration, ion concentration, very little. So even if there wasn't a sodium potassium pump helping to restore and maintain that resting membrane potential, we could just fire thousands of action potentials and that concentration gradient would still be enough. The end, who got third place? Jade, good job. Tanner. Enough excitement. Let's move on. I just finished my attendance. Look, and then there's people that were here when I did it, and it's like they were visible. Noah's here. Kyle's here. Andy's here. Andy, teach me how to say a curse word in Croatian.
Which one?
Trying to think. Oh, did you know Sava? Is he from Croatia?
Yes, he's from Serbia.
Serbia, okay.
Yeah.
One year during a Kahoot, he made his Kahoot name the Serbian word for female part of the anatomy. And then I just kept saying it because he was winning. So the whole time I just kept saying that word.
How did you say it?
And I don't have any memory of it, but I think Milos was in the class at the time too.
Yeah, I know.
Is he from Serbia? So okay. I know Croatia and Serbia are not the same place. Well, geographically. Where are we? Oh yeah, I have some step edits too. It's getting darker earlier. I don't really like that. Makes me not want to leave my house. One of my favorite memes of all time is that one when it gets really cold and it's like once I'm home, I'm not going back out weather. You know, have you seen that meme, JC? All right, did I show you the step edits for? I did, never mind. Okay, I'm just gonna move on. Keep talking to myself. Is anyone gonna dress up for Halloween? Is Zoom, did I stop my meeting? Where's my meeting? Oh, there it is. Is anyone dressing up? What are you gonna be?
The map board exec team is gonna be winning the characters.
That's fun. I like that. One year they were all monsters, ain't people. That was fun. Winnie the Pooh. Who are you gonna be?
I don't know yet, we have to vote on who we want to be. I'm kind of hoping for Eagle, to be honest.
Okay. I like that. Just lay around.
Pretty much, yeah.
All right, let's talk about this action potential. So here's one neuron. It's synapsing onto a second neuron. For some reason, it needs to communicate with it with two different collaterals of the axon, which is not really what would happen. Here's the reading. So we're looking at our graph. On our y-axis is the voltage, right? The membrane potential. It's measured in units of millivolts. Time is in milliseconds over here. So we're going to kind of walk through the steps of what happens during the action potential. So at rest, here we are at -70 millivolts, right? That's our resting membrane potential. Our threshold potential is indicated on the graph with a dotted line. So there's going to be some stimulus. As I've already mentioned, a neuron doesn't necessarily have to have a stimulus. It could just depolarize on its own and start communicating with other neurons. Let's say there's a stimulus. We get a depolarizing event. Again, we are down here in the axon. We've been talking a lot about the integrating center. What we see at the axon would be true at the integrating center as well. In fact, what we see on this graph would be true at almost any point if we probed it along the way. So what really an action potential is going to be a wave of what I show you. So I'm going to show you one graph of it. That's one instant in time. That's happening over and over and over and over as a chain reaction down the length of the axon, right? We did the wave in here. We talked about how if Jade was just starting and Riley jumped up and did it, she'd really seem out of place, right? The ion channels don't do that. One doesn't open up out of place. They only open up sequentially. In fact, they can't until they get the handoff, until they get tagged, right? That membrane depolarization has to happen in order for the next one to open. And I've got step edits for that too. So we get our depolarizing stimulus, we're becoming less negative, right? The red line is starting to go up. If the membrane depolarizes to the threshold value of -55, right, then the voltage gated sodium and potassium ion channels start to open. So again, they're voltage gated ion channels. They open when the membrane potential reaches -55 millivolts. That's the threshold value. Why is the threshold value? Because that's the value that the membrane potential has to be in order for the ion channels to open. I said it 3 different times. So I hope that you understand that's an important point. So this is the all or nothing, right? We're going to get all, right? Because we reach threshold. Real quick, what would happen if we didn't? Let's say we only depolarized to -56 millivolts. What would happen to this line? It would just go right back down and start maintaining. But in this instance, it didn't. We are going to get opening of our potassium and sodium ion channels. So they're going to both open at the same time, right? We hit -55, sodium ion channel pops right open. Hits -55 at the same time, all of the potassium ion channels open really slowly. So the first thing that happens, what we call the rising phase of the action potential or the depolarization phase. So depolarization kind of has 2 meanings. We use it to just refer to any instance where we're becoming less negative. It's also specific to a stage of the action potential. So this is known as the depolarizing phase. So that is when we get rapid entry of sodium ions into the cell membrane, right? Sodium ions rush in. The membrane continues to become less negative. Right around here, we're going to see the graph peak at 30 millivolts and start to come back down. So a couple more notes. We're using 30 millivolts as the peak for action potentials in this book. Other books might use 40, 35. It's variable in what people say it is. We're going with 30 for this class. Why does it peak at 30? So remember the inactivation gate? Right around that time, it is closed. Also, right around that time, the potassium ion channels are fully open. So now that sodium is no longer rushing into the cell, and now potassium is rushing back out of the cell, we're going to become more negative again. It's officially there. So weird. Good God. So, okay, remember, I'm going back to this where I've been doing this whole situation. And that's not Having a microphone is not great for all the cussing I do. My baby says the F word a lot. I'm trying to deprogram him. You want a fork? Here's a fork. Frog, ribbit. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about this. And I remember, I'm just hearkening back to this when I said to you all, what happens if a sodium ion channel opens? What direction do the sodium ions go? In, everyone says in, right? So we've got positive charges coming in. So I'm just reminding you that that's where that flipping is. That's where we're becoming less negative because all of these positive ions out here are coming in. We are making the disequilibrium less disequal. That's not a word. Right? And eventually it becomes positive because all of those sodium ions have rushed in. Now we've stopped this process. Furthermore, we've opened up potassium ion channels. You guys know potassium ion channels rush out. So all of those positive charges that just rushed in are basically rushing back out, right? That's how we get back to our resting membrane potential. So this is known as repolarization. So this is indicating when the inactivation gates are closing. Here, the potassium ion channels are open. And again, this is called repolarization. So this phase, this is a very characteristic graph that I'm showing you. And so you'll see it in many different versions throughout the slides and just kind of what are we looking at? Resting membrane potential. There's the threshold value. This is when the first sodium ion channels open. As all the sodium ion channels open and the sodium ions rush in, we depolarize, we're less negative. Once the sodium inactivation gate closes and the potassium ion channels open, now we are becoming more negative again. So the only time we call this increase in negative membrane potential, repolarization, is during an action potential. So earlier we were just kind of talking about, here's your graph, here we are at rest. If we go down, we call that hyperpolarizing, that's inhibitory, and that's true. We're not returning to the resting membrane potential. So to say repolarization is specific to this phase of an action potential. And I'm just saying it because one or two of you will later on call hyperpolarization repolarization. And then you'll get it wrong, and then you'll remember that I told you this. So there is one part here where we go below resting membrane potential. So at this point, we are hyperpolarized. We're below the resting membrane potential. Remember how I told you the potassium ion gates are slow? So when ions rush down their concentration gradient, diffusion's pretty quick, right? So it'd be like, if all of you are running out the door, and I was trying to close the door to trap you guys in here with me, but I was closing it really slowly, some extra of you would escape, right? So that's what's happening. The potassium ion channel, it's closing so slowly that extra potassium ions rush out. And if you recall, I said we don't really need the movement of very many many ions at all to drastically change the membrane potential. So just those few extra potassium ions that rush out before the gate is closed cause the membrane to briefly go into hyperpolarization. So it can hyperpolarize down around like -80, -85. But then eventually that gets corrected and we go back up to the resting membrane potential. Do you know what corrects this last little bit and gets us back to our -70 value? The sodium potassium pump. So this is where the sodium potassium pump comes into play. It maintains resting membrane potential all of the time because of leak channels. There are sodium and potassium leak channels in the neuron. Something else. Oh, okay, so remember how we said that the membrane potential at rest, we call it polarized, right? Because it's more negative on the inside than it is on the outside. This depolarization, think about D meaning like to undo something, right? And that's why it's called depolarization, because we're trying to undo that, right? Then this phase is called repolarization because we're going back to that original polar state, right? That polarized state of a negative 70 millivolt difference between the outside and the inside of the cell. Is it starting to gel a little bit? All of these different things? Okay. Then we're back to rest. So I uploaded these step edits into Brightspace so that you can pull them up and go through them yourself. So this is the sodium ion gate. And we have our activation gate right here. And the inactivation gate is drawn as this little ball. Most textbooks don't even teach the inactivation gate. And they just act like it's a mystery why the thing peaks at 30. But here we go. So at the resting membrane potential, the activation gate is closed. Yeah. And the inactivation gate is open. And I told you guys that, right? An activation gate's closed, it opens upon stimulation. An inactivation gate is open, and it closes upon stimulation. Here's the extracellular side of the membrane. Here's the membrane. Here's the intracellular side. These are indicating the charge difference, which you are acutely familiar with. We are at negative 70 millivolts. Once we reach threshold value, that's when our activation gate flies open, right? Whips open super fast. Sodium ions are rushing in the entire time the activation gate is open. That peak at that 30 occurs, right, once this closes. And I should point out that here, look, paying attention to the charge differences, as the sodium ions are starting to rush in, we're starting to see that flip in the membrane potential until it's more positive on the inside and more negative on the outside, right? That's what we get here. Then as the inactivation gate closes, the membrane potential returns to resting membrane potential. So toward the end of that, the inactivation gate does eventually open back up, but by the time it does, the activation gate is back closed. Okay, how is that? You all have a quiz tomorrow too, so don't forget that, right? Yeah, you have a quiz. All right. So I was starting to talk about this, and I think that this step edit helps to kind of realize why the action potential only moves in one direction, especially now that you know about the inactivation gates. So a graded potential is shown here in the trigger zone or that axon hillock region, right? The sodium ions are concentrated in that axon initial segment. And if you're wondering, like, is there overlap between these? Yes, these are kind of made up boundaries. These are pointing you in the general area where things are happening. But that the trigger zone, the integrating center, the axon initial segment where the action potential first occurs, they're all geographically roughly that same area. So we have a supra-threshold graded potential, right? If you recall that term, it just indicates, doesn't tell you what the value of the stimulus is, it just tells you that it was enough to trigger an action potential. So when that happens, the voltage gated sodium ion channels would open and then sodium ions would rush in. What you are seeing here, the yellow is kind of indicating where that electrical current is. And remember, we talked about how the electrical current inside a cell can only go a short distance. And we're talking like millimeters, like maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 millimeters. And then the signal just really peters out because of all of that resistance in the cytoplasm and in the membrane as well. So what we see here is that the electrical signal would spread in this direction. It actually spreads in that direction too. It's not drawn here because it doesn't do anything. Why? There are no sodium ion channels back here. There are only sodium ion channels from the axon initial segment down toward the end of the axon. So that's the first reason why we get a one-way direction of the action potential. So here you see that because we get the spreading of that electrical signal, right? Anywhere that gets depolarized to -55, all of those sodium ion channels would also open. Yeah, those open, here's our sodium rushing in. If sodium is rushing in right around here, we're getting our spread in both directions, right? Which is what the arrows show. That spreading of the electrical current is going out in all directions. It's radiating out from that site where the sodium ions are rushing in through those channels. Now, the question is, why are these sodium ion channels right here not opening? If the membrane here is in fact depolarizing to -55, which it is, why are the sodium ion channels back here not opening? Why is the action potential not moving backwards? And I'm asking you. What's preventing these from opening? The activation gate. Well, the inactivation gate first and then the activation gate. Yep. So these just opened, right? So likely the inactivation gate is closed. And I told you there's overlap in time between when that inactivation gate opens back up, the other gate is already closed. So there's no way for that sodium ion channel to open. It has just been stimulated. Those inactivation gates are closed. It's not going to happen. So even though the signal goes backwards, it's not going to have any effect. So this is how we get this one-way movement of the action potential down the length of the axon. So again, here, same thing. Our sodium ions are rushing in. Our current is spreading in all directions, but the inactivation gates back here are closed. So we only open up the gates toward the distal end of the axon. And then don't forget, following the closure of the inactivation gate and then the resetting of the sodium ion channels, these potassium ion channels open up. And so that wave of repolarization follows right behind the wave of depolarization. So we have a wave of depolarization followed by a wave of repolarization. And when all is said and done, our neuron is back at the resting membrane potential. Okay. Okay. Questions? All right. So let's talk about the refractory period. Have you ever heard that term before? What we're looking at here is similar to what you may have heard of a refractory period before. So after an action potential fires, there is a period of time in which another one cannot be stimulated to fire. So we have to wait. There's a minimal wait time in between action potentials. We can increase the frequency of them up to a point, but then at a certain point, called the refractory period, we cannot. So 1 to 2 milliseconds after the action potential, we cannot fire another one. And there's two phases of this. So the absolute refractory period means no action potential will be fired no matter what the stimulus is, no matter how big it is, no matter how large, nothing. That's absolute. Relative refractory period means maybe if the stimulus is big enough, we would fire one. And really it's saying that whatever size of stimulus that normally gets us an action potential is not going to be enough during the relative refractory period. We would need a much larger than normal stimulus to fire an action potential. Why? So here is the absolute refractory period highlighted in the pink area on the graph. We have our inactivation gates closed. That helps ensure our one-way travel. That during that time, if an inactivation gate is closed, that is absolute refractory period time. If we get to it, once the inactivation gate has opened back up and it's just being blocked by the normal activation gate, then we could fire an action potential. But if it's during this time of hyperpolarization, then we would need a larger stimulus than normal. Does that make sense? Because in that brief hyperpolarized state, during an action potential, we could in fact fire another one. We would just need a bigger stimulus than normal. But any time during the action potential, when the inactivation gates are closed, you could have the strongest stimulus ever, and it's not going to cause an action potential because of that inactivation gate. Would the activation gate still fly open? I don't know, probably, but since the other one's closed, nothing's happening. And then up here is kind of giving you a little diagram that goes along time-wise with what is happening. So this is how we get conduction without decrement. I just did that, but my point with this slide or this picture from the book was really to show you, you know what? If I could stimulate a neuron right dead center in the middle of the axon, so instead of doing it here in that normal trigger zone, if I could apply electrode in the middle of an axon, I would actually trigger action potentials to go in both directions. Because remember, at the axon hillock, as I told you, there are no sodium ion channels up here. If there were sodium ion channels here, then we would get movement of the electrical current in both directions. So if I were to stimulate this dead center, there's sodium ion channels here, there's sodium ion channels here, right? They would all open and then they would start the chain reaction going in that direction. And then neither one would be able to move backwards because of the inactivation gate. Does this make sense? If it doesn't, I can say it again. I can say it again. So normally when we have an action potential, we have sodium ion channels going down the axon, but we have none here. So if the membrane were to depolarize to the threshold value, we would get spreading of the current in both directions. But because there are no sodium ion channels here, it's just that nothing happens. That action potential doesn't move toward the cell body. If I could artificially stimulate an axon right in the middle, which is not normal, right? That's not how it normally happens. And there are plenty of sodium ion channels in both directions, then having the sodium ions rush in here, having the current spread in both directions, I would actually start triggering an action potential to the left. I would start triggering an action potential to the right. Both would only proceed in the direction that they're going in, because eventually you're going to start getting inactivation gates closing, right? And so this signal is not going to be able to move backwards. As this one's moving forward, the inactivation gates are closing. That would not allow that one to move backwards. So I just did that. All right, let's talk about myelinated axons. Everything I've been telling you up to this point has been about unmyelinated axons. What type of a neuron, or what characteristics of a neuron would you expect to have myelinated axons? What do they do? What are they for? What do they help? What's a myelinated axon do? Or at least start saying words that you think of when you hear that term. It's usually what you guys do anyway. Myelinated axons. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Catch the ruler, Sammy, go. Myelinated axons.
Reaction time?
A reaction time? What reaction? It's fine. Josh, what you got?
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going. With, like reaction time being faster.
Maybe the action potential getting to the end of the axon faster? Okay, good. So if we want the axon, if this helps the action potential, sorry, that's not COVID friendly. If this helps the action potential get to the end of the axon faster, then what does that tell you about the types of neurons that have myelinated axons? Why would we want something to get to the end of an axon faster? Is that neuron more important? No, it's not. Sorry, Dan. It was, and I appreciate you just making eye contact and nodding like you're listening. It's along an axon. If myelination speeds up the action potential, then the expectation is that we would find it on really long axons. Okay, now you're so convincing too, Tanner. You're just like, I know what you mean. It's fine. I do that all the time at meetings. I just smile and nod. Right? You guys do that every day. What?
Smile and wave, boys. Smile and wave.
What's that from?
Madagascar. Penguins.
I'm not familiar with it. I mean, I know what it is. I block out kids' movies, except Pixar. Conduction is faster in larger neurons and myelinated axons. So that's why we have myelinated axons. Because in terms of, I don't know, whatever the cost benefits are of having certain size organs, for humans, it doesn't work out really well for us to have these big, thick, fat axons. So like whales, you think about like a whale neuron, it's huge, and the axon is huge. That's beneficial for the whale because it helps the action potential travel really fast, right? Whales are gigantic, that axons, they've got some really long axons. The action potential needs to get to the other side just as quickly as it would to a neuron that's a couple inches away. So with humans, like I said, not super helpful, right? If we had axons that were the diameter of our arms, it's just not going to work out. So the way that we have made up for that is by using myelin sheaths to speed up the rate of an action potential. So the myelin sheaths, how do they help this process? Because I've told you that they do. One way is that they minimize ion leak. They're oftentimes talked about as insulators, right? And when we think about insulator, that's really in an electrical sense. Something's either a conductor or an insulator. Electricity can flow through it or it can't. Myelin sheaths are great insulators. They help prevent the ions from leaking out of the axon. That helps the current get just a touch further, right? We talked about one of the reasons why we might lose graded potential current over distance, right? You guys all know that graded potential loses its strength over distance is because of the ion leak channels that exist. Because at rest, a neuron is in such a state of disequilibrium, and because those leak channels exist, we have sodium constantly leaking into the inside of the cell, and we have potassium constantly leaking out of the cell. It's just how it is. So having these myelin sheaths really prevents a lot of that leaking from happening. So it helps the current get through the inside of the cell. Sodium and potassium channels are highly concentrated at the nodes. In fact, they are likely absent underneath where the myelin sheaths are. The nodes of Ranvier can only be 1 to 2 millimeters apart. Why? How far did I tell you electrical current could travel through a cell? Not far. 3, 4, 5 millimeters. But if it makes it 5 millimeters, it's going to lose strength as it travels that 5 millimeter distance, right? So 1 to 2 millimeters is the sweet spot. Because if we get depolarization in this node, if this one is close enough, then that current will reach it. And then we get these ion channels to open. So remember when I did the example, you know, thinking of an unmyelinated axon, and the action potential is really just kind of going step by step through each sodium ion channel, right, to get to the end. And that just takes a little bit more time. With the myelin sheaths, what you're getting the equivalent of is being able to just jump from space to space, right? Node to node. And so that is going to greatly increase the rate of your reaction. I shouldn't say rate of reaction, the rate of your action potential moving through the axon. So this is why we say that saltatory conduction leaps from node to node. And it, for whatever reason, it's always drawn as an arrow and it's leaping, and everyone thinks that the electrical current actually arcs out of the neuron and goes from node to node, but it doesn't. So saltatory conduction, what's that? That is the high-speed conduction of the action potential through a myelinated axon as it jumps from node to node. And it doesn't really jump. But you can say that, it's fine. So multiple sclerosis is a disease, it's chronic, it's progressive. It is an autoimmune disease. Unfortunately, your immune system gets all confused and it starts attacking the myelin sheaths in your central nervous system. Age of onset is around 20 to 40. And I just hate how the early symptoms of like so many deadly and chronic devastating diseases are like, oh, you feel tired, or you're kind of dizzy, you got a headache, you just don't feel right. But that is some of the early signs of it. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, this is progressive. So you really start to lose control of your muscles, messing up the myelin sheaths, destroying them. It leaves scar tissue behind. That's where the sclerosis part of the name of the disease comes from, as the myelin sheaths are getting broken down. As I told you, a lot of those ion channels aren't even located under the myelin sheaths. So what do you think is going to happen to the action potential if our myelin sheaths get broken down?
Gonna slow down.
It's going to slow down. It might eventually stop depending on how many myelin sheaths get broken down or how much scar tissue forms. So as we start taking really important neurons out of the equation, we start losing our ability to control our eyes. So vision might take a hit. Walking, balance, coordination. You just might feel like you have needles stabbing into you all of the time. So really not fun things going on with this disease. This is an active area of research and trying to figure out ways to, you know, help people, you know, slow down the progression. But right now there aren't any cures. It's pretty common in the population. I would imagine at least one of you in this room knows someone with MS. I know someone with MS. It just depends on what neurons are being affected in terms of what the kind of outcome of that for that person is. A lot of people end up walking with a cane or using a wheelchair. Selma Blair is an actress that has been outspoken about her own MS, and she uses a cane when she's on red carpets. All right, chemical factors alter electrical activity. So that resting membrane potential is based on the disequilibrium of ions, right? On the inside and the outside of the membrane. So if we start messing with that, or actually we're talking about channels right now, if we start messing with ion channels, then we're gonna mess with this whole process. So a large variety of chemicals alter action potential conduction by binding to either sodium channels, potassium channels, or calcium channels. Calcium channels are important at the axon terminal for neurotransmitter release. So I think that it intuitively makes sense that if we block these channels, we're gonna start messing up how action potentials work. Neurotoxins, what does that sound like to you? Cocktail you wanna have? No, it sounds like something very bad that we don't want to touch our neurons because it's going to kill them, right? Neurotoxins, they bind to sodium ion channels. Binding to sodium ion channels is a really good way to disrupt the activity of neurons. Yes, communication stops. And then you die. Local anesthetics such as Procaine, they block sensation. They also block sodium ion channels. Now it depends on what sodium ion channels we're blocking. There's many different subtypes. Different subtypes exist in different tissues. But that is the basis for some anesthetics. Do you know what this guy is? He is. Does anyone ever ate this? No. Are you of Japanese descent? I can't remember. Okay. Do you have any relatives in Japan that have eaten it? I'm just curious. This is a very big deal. Still, a handful of people die every year in Japan from eating these. Wait, I thought I had a slide on it. Hold on, I'm gonna just jump down to this. So here's that. This is just a synopsis of, it's a summary. You don't need to know these, but I thought this was fun. The book talked about it. So this poisonous spider, its poison affects voltage gated calcium ion channels. This guy, I can't even say his name, bungarotoxin. He has a venom that affects your nicotinic receptors. Those control your skeletal muscles. So that causes paralysis. This hideous thing affects your voltage gated calcium ion channels too. Isn't it funny how they're so scary looking and deadly, like how they co-evolve that anyway? And then the pufferfish affects your sodium ion channels, and it's a delicacy, and you have to get all of this training to learn how to cut the fish because even the tiniest drop of it will kill people that eat it, but people go out of their way to eat it, and then someone dies every year. And some people just eat it a little bit because it makes your face go numb, and they eat it on purpose to speed up evolutions, I guess. All right, going back to this. So what is the primary determinant? I'll talk about it in the video that you're gonna get from me because it's time to leave. So I'll give you a Kahoot, a video, and you'll have a quiz. And I'm also gonna give you an exam worksheet. Are there any questions?
The quiz is opening tomorrow, right?
Yep.
Okay.
What time?
Isn't it 5?
It is at 5. Are you selling clothes in class?